Today on Call for Two, Mortum Medieval Detective, a spoiler-free quick before you buy it review. What is it? Who is it for? Stay tuned to find out. Mortum Medieval Detective is a cooperative mystery-adventure game set in a magical fantasy world. Mortum was published in 2021 by Arcane Wonders and was designed by Sergei Minovich. It's listed for ages 12 and up, there's no graphic content that would disturb young children, and the stories are suitable for a wide age range. It's essentially a solo game, but like many mystery games, can be played by a group making collective decisions. The box contains 3 scenarios which form a connected campaign. The first scenario is shorter, simpler, and serves as a kind of introductory tutorial. The remaining 2 scenarios will take you 2 to 3 hours each to play and are essentially non-replayable, since the narrative mystery will be explained at the end of each game. Rules are minimal and there is no rulebook, just cards and tokens and a short FAQ sheet. Each scenario consists of a large stack of about 100 oversized and lavishly illustrated cards. Play begins by simply reading the initial cards in the scenario deck, which walk the players through the setup for the scenario and explain the rules. Each of the 3 scenarios use the same basic rules, with minor new rules being introduced in later scenarios. Each scenario presents the player with a mystery to solve, something to figure out. In the first game, players will choose their team of characters, which essentially determine which mix of skill tokens the players will play each subsequent scenario with. Skill tokens are required to perform actions at different locations, such as searching, surveilling, and raiding. On each turn, players will collectively decide which action to take from those available on face-up cards in play. Taking an action will instruct players to retrieve and reveal new cards from various decks. These new cards may gradually fill out a map in the center of the table, or advance the scenario story and make new actions available. Some actions may require certain tokens to perform, and most will advance the time clock, pushing your adventure towards a tight deadline. 3 of these actions are key to your adventure: searching, surveilling, and raiding. Each reveals a unique card from a special deck detailing the results of taking that action at that location. Some tokens are refreshed at the end of each game night cycle when players rest, and so must be used regularly and efficiently. Other tokens are refreshed at the start of each scenario and are more precious. Still others, like coins, which can be used to bribe characters or buy items, carry over between scenarios and are never automatically refreshed. Each scenario will take place over the course of several day and night cycles, with a strict time clock that limits the number of actions the players will be able to take. Because of the tight time limit and limited resources, each group that plays will follow substantially different paths and see perhaps half of the available scenario cards. When players have used up all the turns allowed for a scenario, they are instructed to reveal endgame cards, which contain a series of about 10 multiple-choice questions. Players are scored based on their answers to those questions, and then read a short epilogue to the scenario, which sets up the next scenario. So what exactly is Mortum Medieval Detective? It's billed as a deductive mystery adventure game set in a fantasy world. You might think of it as a choose your own path to evidence narrative reading game. It's heavy on a feeling of adventure and exploration. It has mystery elements, and you win or lose each scenario based on how well you can answer questions about the underlying mystery. It has a little bit of a feel of an RPG game, but with very hard and fast rules. and it's got a strict time limit and resource limits in order to motivate tough decision making. There's no luck per se, but lots of arguably arbitrary decision making. And as to whether you're going to like it, just a little reminder before we get started that these one-off narrative mystery games are especially subjective. So don't take my word for it. Cast a wide net to looking at reviews before you decide whether to pass or play this game. Let's go over some of the highlights of the game. First, the production quality is very high. The cards are beautiful. They're illustrated in different styles depending on the nature of the card. There's lots of generous text. Everything just looks nice and feels nice and is a pleasure to use. There's a real feeling of exploring a map here. You find these map cards that piece together. Sometimes you flip them over when you discover something new. It has a little bit of a Seventh Continent vibe, although nowhere near the ambition and scope of Seventh Continent. In terms of story, there are occasional brief moments of some very cool, strange magic and creatures. They're too far and few between, but there are occasional very nice moments. There's some very clever mechanics too. There's a day and night cycle. Time is very tight in this game, and you have to rest at the end of each night. There are frequently multiple places you can rest. You have to decide when to go to sleep, and then how to deal with fatigue. If you stay up too late, you've got a couple ways to mitigate that. And you even have special actions you can take at night that may depend on where you chose to go to sleep and occasional events that happen between days. It does make the world feel alive. There's also some interesting resource management stuff going on here. It's very light compared to something like a Euro game. But it is interesting to see how this game deals with resource use compared to other mystery games like Detective Modern Crime Board Game. Here it's much less punishing. Depending on the characters you pick, you'll get different number of tokens. Some of the tokens refresh every day, some refresh every scenario, some don't refresh at all. And unlike something like Detective Modern Crime Board Game, where you only have a couple of tokens and you frequently get to some clue that you're not allowed to look at because you don't have the token, here it's handled quite differently. You basically have these decks of cards, and for every location on the map, you can search them, surveil them, or raid them. And that means there's always something to do with your tokens. It's rare that you get into a situation where you need a token and you don't have, although it can happen. But most of your decision is going to be, where should we spend this token? And because the main search, surveil, and raid tokens refresh every night, you basically have no reason not to use each of those tokens once per day. And so you never have that bad feeling of, oh, I want to do this, but I can't do anything. You're more like deciding, well, what's the best place to search each day? What's the best place to surveil each day? What's the best place to raid each day? And depending on your playstyle, you might pick a different party which has more of one token, more of the other. The game is also clever about introducing a couple new mechanics through each of the 3 scenarios, so there's always something slightly new happening to wrap your head around, and a fun new rule that gets introduced at each scenario. As I said in the rules overview, these 3 cases make up a campaign. The first case is pretty much like a throwaway tutorial. So there are only really 2 full scenarios in this game. But there are some things that carry over between the scenarios through the campaign. Occasionally you'll get a card that's got a keyword on it that might affect what you read in a subsequent campaign. The idea that there are some resources that don't refresh, like coins, so you're a little bit worried about whether you should spend them in this scenario or whether you're going to need them in the next scenario. And then there's a clever little thing where your party of characters might actually grow between scenarios and add new abilities, and that's quite fun. Let's talk about some negatives. One big negative is something we see in a lot of these mystery narrative games that try to add a gamey element, which is most of your choices feel very arbitrary and like there's no real logical way to figure out whether you should search or surveil or raid. Every action is designed to provide you some information, so it's almost irrelevant to a large degree what you do at any specific location. You're just going to get a different way the story is told to you. And when we played it, the first mission, we sort of tried to spend a lot of time logically figuring out what's the smartest action to take at any given moment. By the time we finished the first scenario, we decided it would be more enjoyable to sort of role play it and make decisions based on what our characters would want to do or what's more psychologically fun or interesting. There's also very little actual mystery and deduction required here. This is not a hardcore, serious deduction game like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, where you're really sitting there trying to put together the dots to understand the underlying mystery. It's quite shallow and straightforward, except to the extent that some of the questions are tiny little trivial questions about, like, what was the color of the shoes someone was wearing, just stuff that you sort of don't care about, you're not motivated to care about, and you would have had to really dig down deep to figure out what the proper answers to certain questions would be. Instead of focusing on the big picture important stuff, it seems sometimes the questions are focusing on the trivial and insignificant. I've talked about the fact that there are 3 cases in this box, and one of them really feels thin and boring and more like a tutorial. So that means there are 2 actual cases that I can recommend in this game. They take maybe 2 hours each. That's not very much content for a game that might cost you $40 or so. And there's no replayability here. Once you play a scenario, you learn about it, you have it solved, you're told the answers, you really can't replay it. It feels like maybe there was more planned. There is one additional scenario that will presumably be for sale. But it does feel like you're not getting that much for the cost of this. The decision to not have a rule book in this game was probably a bad one. It's in general a bad decision. You can see why it could be appealing. There are lots of people who don't like reading rules, and maybe for them there is some appeal to not having a rule book. But I think the solution is you can still teach someone how to play the game during the tutorial, but you should always have a rule book. You have a rule book so players can learn the rules before they start playing. So if they're having a group come over, they're ready to play. And you have a rule book so that you can refer back to it. It was particularly glaring that there was no rule book when we got to the second or third scenario and couldn't quite remember certain rules. And if you play this game with some weeks between missions, you're going to have a very hard time remembering all the rules. You'll have to break out the first box and sort through it and look at card backs to try to refresh your memory how the game works. Bad choice. The writing. These kinds of games, which you might call narrative reading games, where most of what you're doing is reading a story, they work best when the writing is engaging with memorable characters and humor and wit and stuff. That's not really found here. Occasionally we get a feel of a medieval village or world or interesting characters, but I would say for the most part, it's fairly unengaging, fairly generic. There are no real memorable characters to talk to, no real humor. The player party that we take into the game has essentially no backstory, no personality, no names, and no motivation. That's a real miss here. We don't really know or care about why we're in this world and what we're supposed to be doing. There are a couple weird elements here too that also make you think there was additional content planned but not written. There's some tokens for combat and characters that you can take for combat, but there's almost no combat in this entire game, and I think that suggests another flaw that we see in these kinds of games, which is your group could get unlucky. If you make some unlucky choices, bring the wrong characters in, spend your tokens somewhat unwisely, you could have a fairly unpleasant experience and not be able to replay it and fix it. That's a little dangerous. And on a related note to having to make arbitrary decisions about what to do, there's a little bit of confusion here in these three main actions. There's search around, there's surveillance, which you might imagine following a person or looking for a person. Then there's raid, and the raid action feels a little different than the other two, but it's also a little ambiguous. For the most part, it sounds like you're sort of rushing in with weapons drawn, but occasionally it's used for something different, and it feels like it's a little unfair. Like if they had been more open-ended about what it meant, maybe you'd choose that more often. And I've talked about the time management and the resource optimization and planning. And while I do think it serves its purpose to sort of motivate you to worry about your decisions and try to plan your actions carefully and efficiently, I think it's minimally strategic. And while it's an improvement from games like Detective Modern Crime, I don't think it may be unwelcome for some players. Okay, so who is going to appreciate Mortum Medieval Detective? I think we're talking about people who love magic and fantasy and medieval time period worlds. Fans of choose your own adventure type games and role playing, but who want a little bit of mystery to solve. And maybe fans of open world games where they like the idea that different groups are going to see different paths of information and like the idea that their group is going to have a unique experience compared to others. Who might this not be the game for? I think fans of pure inductive, deductive reasoning, people who love Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective to be mentally challenged to figure out a mystery, people who don't like skill tests and resource optimization in their mystery games, people who are really serious about the reading and want the highest quality novel-like storytelling, people who are completionists and don't like the idea about being forced to guess solutions before they're ready and before they've seen all the evidence, people who don't like the idea of having to make choices based on their gut or role-playing versus logic, and maybe those who are easily upset by an unlucky choice, the fact that they didn't save a token when surprised, it turns out through no fault of their own that they would have needed one. So if you're sort of opposed to arbitrary bad luck or good luck, then this might not be the game for you. So I really did think that there were some great ideas in this box, and it's a very interesting framework and system, and I would like to see it further developed. So to that end, I want to make a couple of design suggestions here. First one, maybe instead of these 3 decks with a card for each location where you could search at each location, surveil at each location, and raid at each location. We've seen this kind of thing recently in Bureau of Investigations, and I think it's probably not an ideal mechanic. It would be better to have one deck with 1 card for each location, but maybe have some branching decisions on much of the cards. So you go to a place, you can read about it, and then you might be given one of 3 options. You can either, if you see someone interesting, you could surveil them. If you see something interesting to search, you could search it. And sometimes those options won't be available. Maybe continue on this path of having tokens be used to choose your style of tackling a problem rather than being a source of frustration at running out of them. So maybe give the person certain tokens, and you would use a certain token to be able to handle a situation in a different way, or maybe increase the likely success of a certain action. I think lean into this idea of breaking up the scenario into days with day and night cycles. Maybe put more events that happen at the end of each day or at the beginning of each day. Make that decision about whether to stay up late to do something or wake up early more of a interesting gamey decision by having events that take place in the world over time. Maybe some more lean into the night actions. Make the night feel different from the day. I've talked about design decisions leaning on the author maintaining control of the story, and I think a good example here is letting the players choose the makeup of their party, which gives up control of the designer about what kinds of tokens people are going to have. I think probably it might be better to give them a fixed party instead of letting them choose. Try to put more personality into that party and more storytelling. If you know exactly what characters the players are going to have control over, you can incorporate them more into the story more fully. Flesh out the backstory and motivation of the characters that the players play as. Give them more investment in those characters. For me, the most enjoyable part of the game was exploring this world, discovering new locations, flipping a card that showed a new location was found on a map, and hearing about these weird, strange, magical, creepy creatures that lived in this world and the lore of the world. But there was far too little of it. So I would like to see bigger maps, richer maps with more role, more involved in exploring and discovering areas, and I want to see more lore of the world, more creatures and characters that I interact with and have more interesting dialogue with. And as far as the mysteries go, I think lean into bigger, more compelling mysteries where there's more of a challenge to understand what's going on rather than focusing on testing the person on minutia of details that the player doesn't care about and has no reason to care about. Final thoughts here for me. There is a huge amount of unrealized potential in this system. It needs more content. It needs more compelling writing. My advice to you, if you do decide to play it, is play it more fast and loose, like a role-playing adventure. Don't agonize too much over your decisions. The only caveat there, though, is that the questions at the end are going to be asking you about very detailed minutia, at least in some cases. So if you play it fast and loose like a role-playing game, you might miss some of those end game questions if your score matters to you. So I guess for what we have in the box, the content we've seen so far, I probably rate it a 6, 6.5. But I would play more, and I think as a system, great potential, and I would like to see more fully fleshed out stories and campaigns set in this world. If you do like the idea of this game, there are a couple games you might try. I think the one that jumps immediately to mind is Legacy of Dragonholt. It's a longer, more epic campaign. You can see my review of Legacy of Dragonholt and playthrough, and maybe this is a good place to say you can watch my playthrough of all 3 of these cases on YouTube. Legacy of Dragonholt has its own problems and might arguably be said to be significantly more boring and drawn out than this, but it has some similarity. And then the other game that you might check out that I've already mentioned is Detective Modern Crime Board Game, which is card-based and has some of the feel of this game, but leans much more heavily to having a real meaty mystery that you are going to be agonizing and thinking about and trying to solve. It has its own flaws as well. But if you're here for the mystery and cards with a little bit of resource use, Detective Modern Crime Board Game. There you have it, Mortum Medieval Detective, a sort of hybrid game. Some groups are going to really like it. Just know what you're in for.